This is the web transcription service of the Royal Canadian Military Institute. On March the 1st, the Defence and Security Studies program listened to a presentation by Brigadier General Kevin Whale, Director General Space of the Royal Canadian Air Force, on the RCAF and Canada's mission in the space environment: Accelerate, Collaborate, Defend, delivering the space objectives of strong, secure, engaged.
So if you're anything like me, prior to getting into the role that I have now as Director General and Component Commander of Space, you never gave space much thought. All of us use space capabilities in our daily lives, and we don't even realize it. So I'm happy to take any opportunity that I can find to share the story of Canadian Armed Forces' journey right now in space, to tell you what's going on, what our focus is, and how we're dealing with it. And the title of the slide really is my mandate right now: Accelerate, Collaborate, and Defend, delivering on the space objectives of strong, secure, engaged, Canada's new defense policy. So the way I'd like to do that is, first I'd like to talk about the space domain. The 4 C's as we describe them, that really is driving all of our approach to what we're doing right now in space. I'm going to talk about strong, secure, engaged, specifically give some general overview, but specifically the space elements. And then our Canadian Armed Forces Joint Space Program with the Royal Canadian Air Force as the functional lead, and then current and future capabilities. 60 years ago, there was no man-made objects in space. That changed with the launch of Sputnik in 1957. A few years after that, Canada actually was one of the first as well to put an asset in space with the help of our American allies. And as a country, we were the first nation to have an on-orbit streaming video communications capability. And it makes sense, given the size of our country and the population, that Canada would be one of the first ones to do that. So space was recognized a long time ago by our leadership to be important. I had no idea of the rich history that we had in the space domain prior to taking over my current role. So that was 60 years ago. There was only 1 or 2 things in space put there by man. So today, the first C, as we describe it, is congested. Canada has about 55 active satellites and about 5 that are now debris, including that one that we put up almost 60 years ago. It's still up there, not functioning, but it's rotating around. I keep having to update this slide with the number of active satellites. There's over 1,800 active satellites right now on orbit by all countries. There's over 25,000 pieces of debris about the size of your fist that we're trying to track to make sure to avoid collisions. But there's over 500,000 different pieces of parts of little bits of paint, a bolt, some frozen fuel, a discarded rocket body, those kind of things. And if you see that picture in the bottom left, it gives you an indication of, when you zoom out, of the kind of man-made objects that are in space today. And to use an example of where we are now and where we're going, if you look at the gray slide in the upper right, that is the geointelligence satellites on orbit today. And the red line is this year. And if this will build for me. These are the constellations that are planned over the next decade. There's companies planning to put up a few hundred, 1,000, or a few thousand satellites on orbit, especially in the low Earth orbit regime, to provide communications around the globe. And I'll explain why that's becoming possible now. So there's an illustration of what's coming. You can see the bottom left where we are now, and the upper right is an example of what's coming. And that's only one type of satellite. There's also all the communication satellites, all the position, navigation, and timing, the GPS satellites, missile warning, weather, all the small satellites that universities are putting up, all the technology demonstrators, and so on and so on. So right now we're at about 1,800 active satellites. Within the next decade, that's going to be 10,000. Right now, today, there's a launch on this planet about every second day. Within the next few years, there'll be a launch every day somewhere in the world. And now those launches don't go up with one single expensive satellite. A lot of them are going up with 30, 40, 50, 60 satellites on board. So this congested piece is an issue for us for our capabilities that we have in space. The second C is contested. Up until relatively recently, anything that we've put up in space has had really relatively no risk. There's always issues with space weather, solar flares, those kind of things, but there really wasn't anybody threatening our capabilities in space. Now there are a lot of different threats. If you see in the bottom left, in 2007, China did an anti-satellite test where they took out with a missile one of their own satellites that was decaying and instantly created 3,000 pieces of debris that are still up there expanding in that orbit. There are lasers that can blind systems on satellites or even damage the sensors so they won't function anymore. You can launch systems off aircraft. Jamming satellite signals is actually relatively easy. Something like even a GPS signal, you could buy something off the internet and jam the GPS in this room. It's not a really strong signal. Television, radio, anything that's going up and down from space is pretty easy to jam, either the uplink or the downlink. And then probably the biggest concern is cyber. Everything on orbit is a computer. They all use ones and zeros, and probably one of the easiest ways to get into a space system, depending on the protection and the encryption, is through cyber. So these are just some examples of the contested nature of space, and this is a growing concern. So congested, contested. And then competitive. This means so many things. There's now more than 80 countries involved in space, and that's changing every year. You just heard this week, Canada announced that they're going to be a partner on the Lunar Gateway to put the space station-like system around the moon as a way station for capabilities that'll be on the moon, and then actually if you're going to Mars someday, it could be like a way station that you would take a break on and get some fuel and supplies and carry on to Mars. Fascinating project. There's things like space mining. Not only can you find minerals, specific minerals in space that you could bring back to Earth, because the cost of launch is coming down to the point now where the business case is actually viable to do that. There's concepts of mining things in space for the use in space. So rather than have to spend all the expense to launch something on a rocket up to space, put a laser printer in space if you can get the supplies, and you can build it in space, maybe on the moon or maybe on something like a lunar gateway. Or in some cases, some satellites use things like water as propulsion systems, believe it or not. If you can find the water in space somewhere, somehow, then you have a fuel source in space. There's high altitude pseudo-satellite platforms. So if you need communications over an area, you can launch a balloon into the stratosphere and give communications over an area of operations for a short period of time. And Canada, believe it or not, is one of the leaders in development of on-orbit servicing vehicles. So right now, if a satellite is maneuverable and it has a fuel source, once that fuel runs out, that satellite now becomes debris because there's no way to refuel it. And in the not too distant future, we'll be able to actually refuel satellites in space. If a component fails, if we have replacement components on orbit, you can actually fix the satellite on orbit. So this is just an indication of the kind of things that are happening. And this is also what's contributing to that congested piece. There's a lot of countries looking at a lot of different capabilities in space. So congested, contested, competitive, that all means all of our capabilities that Canadians rely on, not just the Canadian Armed Forces, have a growing level of risk. Any one of those C's is compelling enough on its own to drive us to do more faster. the converging of those three, and that's why we're describing it as the 4 Cs, is just overwhelmingly compelling for action. So what do those 4 Cs mean to us? They mean opportunity. For us as a nation, the cost of entry is dropping. To the cadets in this room, you could actually get together and probably launch your own satellite as a hosted item on another launch. Disruptive innovation. The United Kingdom has a satellite system on orbit right now that's doing real-time video from space, just as an example. The socioeconomic spin-off benefits for us as a country, I guarantee you, all of you have items in your home that are a direct result of investment in innovation in space technology that we're now using on a day-to-day basis. The growing commercial capabilities, interplanetary exploration, and really, I'm simplifying here, but we can see everything. Try to move a warship right now anywhere on the globe without any one of you being able to watch it on the internet. So how do we conduct our operations now when everything is visible? So that's the opportunity side. And every time I get a briefing by a company that's got a great new idea, I get excited about what it can do for Canadians or for the armed forces. 30 seconds later, my thoughts are, who else are you going to sell it to? So there's also the risk element here, right? Adversaries have just as much access to space as we do, and that access is growing because of the dropping cost. Innovation is outpacing our policy and procurement policies. The risks of collisions and counter space activity are growing. Our freedom of maneuver in space, our space superiority, basically is no longer guaranteed. Enforcement of treaties and norms. There's been treaties since 6 decades ago when we started putting items up in space. There's a lot of UN treaties that have been around since then, or shortly after those early launches. We've never had to enforce them. And now we're we have to actually start enforcing them, which is causing legal reviews and assessments. And again, potential friction points. And if we can see everything, whoever they can see everything as well. Every country can take great benefit from space-based capabilities. Canada has the 2nd largest landmass on this planet and the population of roughly California. To say that space-based capabilities mean a lot to Canadians for communications, for navigation, for surveillance of ice flows, ice caps, farming industries, there's huge opportunity for Canada to take benefit from space-based capabilities. From the military point of view, we've been using space capabilities since I joined, and I never gave it a moment's thought until I got into this job. Missile warning, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, guidance systems for precision strike to limit collateral damage, weather, which we all need for operations, improvised explosive device detection. You can actually detect with satellite technology. If someone has embedded something in a road, you can actually see where the earth has been disturbed and go and avoid it or go deal with it. Satellite communications, of course. Position navigation and timing, so all of the GPS systems that we rely on and we all have on our cell phones that we use almost every day. Surveillance of space. We're trying to get better at tracking everything that's going on in space. And then C3 systems for command, control, and computer. These capabilities have always been force multiplying for military operations. Now we can't really do without them. We can always do without them. We always have backup plans. But these capabilities, we've become so reliant on them that we really need to do everything we can to protect those systems that are providing these capabilities for us. All of that 4C assessment went in through this process when Canada's defense policy was being developed. So what's the security environment? What's the so what's for those 4Cs? What are the Canadians' interests? What's the vision for defense for Canada? What's the determination of what roles and missions do we think we need to be involved in now and in the future? required capabilities, what are the gaps, what kind of investments are Canadians willing to make, and all to have a Canadian Armed Forces that's relevant to Canada. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is an overview of all of the so what's, and not just for space, but for all elements of Canadian Armed Forces. But if you look in the lower right there, space and cyber as an example very clearly came out as important items for our defense policy. What came out of all that was government decided and agreed we needed to be strong at home, secure in North America, and engaged in the world. Not one of those missions occurs without space, whether it's communications, navigation, surveillance, not one of them. We've also recognized that we want to get better at a strategic level at anticipation, adapting and acting when we want to, and you can see the capabilities in red there. Again, space is enabling throughout all of that. This is the summary of what the entire policy looks like. And again, I'm not going to go through it, but you can see the detail in the strong at home, secure North America, engaged in the world. Going from about 0.9% GDP to 1.4 over 20 years, that's a remarkable investment. It's very aggressive, but we've got a great path forward. And if you see the three lines there along the bottom, the most important thing is a focus on our support to our people. In the middle there, investing in capabilities, and in red, those are the space capabilities that we've recognized are the highest payoff, and I'm going to talk about those. And then the bottom line there is modernizing how we actually manage defense as a business. All of that, if you think of in the bottom half there, if you think of those as kind of marbles, there was a 20-year box of funding that the government was willing to allocate, and we have a plan 20 years out now for all capabilities, including the space ones that I'm going to talk about. Specifically, what the document said about space, for the first time ever, because of the recognition of the so what's of the 4 Cs, we need to defend and protect our capabilities. We didn't have that mandate previously because there really wasn't a lot of risk. Now there is, and we're putting our minds to how do we do that. We're going to invest and employ a range of space capabilities that I'm going to talk about. We really are upping our game and working with partners to promote our national interests on space issues. We're providing leadership and shaping those international norms and behaviors around the world. And with our science and technology colleagues, they're putting a lot of effort in cutting edge research and development on innovative space capabilities. So what does defend mean? We're using this kind of a framework to help us get our mind around what does defend mean. So of course it's defensive operations, so maybe satellites need protective systems so that if something comes nearby, it's got at least have sensors on to tell that something's nearby. If it's a laser issue, maybe it's got an automatic shutter where it can block the laser, those kind of things. Reconstitution. The cost of launch is coming down to a point now where I can actually have lower cost satellites on the shelf, and if a satellite on orbit gets compromised, within days, if not hours, I can launch a replacement capability. Just like we would if an aircraft got damaged in operations, we would replace it with a backup. We're getting to the point soon where we'll be able to look at these kind of capabilities. And then all of the resiliency pieces of defend and protect. Why put up one big satellite that sits in geostationary orbit that never moves, that an adversary could take a great big juicy target at? Maybe now I can put up 50 satellites in a different orbit, and if a couple of them get compromised, I still have my capability. So we're looking at all of these kind of things, and at the base of all of it is situational awareness. We have to know what's going on in space, much more than we do today. These are all of the policies and framework agreements that we have to take into account when we're building our space capabilities. Of course, the law of physics is paramount. All of those UN treaties, government regulations for radio communications, for remote sensing, Aeronautics Act if we're launching through airspace, of course our National Defense Act, We have air doctrine, and we now have draft of space doctrine. That's how we operate in this domain. As a nation, we have a space policy framework. We know we need to replace that. And if you see those links there, Don't Let Go Canada and Space Matters, if you go to those links, you get a ton of information on the rich heritage of what Canadians have built in space and what will happen if we don't get our act together with a national strategy to protect it and go to the next level. So this is my mandate, is to maintain space domain awareness on behalf of the Canadian Armed Forces with my team, develop and deliver and assure those space-based capabilities that we rely on for operations, all focused on our joint warfighters, either here in Canada or deployed. This is an outline of the organization that I work with right now. My position is in the middle, and you see it's dual-hatted. So if I look on the right, as Director General of Space, it's kind of about the projects and managing the program. And if you look on the right, I've got a Director of Space Requirements for surveillance, reconnaissance, and SATCOM projects. In the middle, I've got a Director of Space Strategy and Plans, dealing with all the policy, the engagement, the force generation, coordination with the research and development. I've got a space coordinator that links me now in with the rest of the Air Force staff. And then if you look on the left, the component commander function, we've got a Canadian Space Operations Center, we call it the CANSPOC, that 24/7. Right now, there's a non-commissioned officer sitting in a room, a dark room with screens, connected with our allies, watching what's going on in space, monitoring our systems, providing feedback to troops on the ground, getting requests from Armed Forces members in Canada or deployed for communications, navigation, all those kind of things. Normally, on a day-to-day basis, I report to the commander of the Royal Canadian Air Force. For the component commander function, I'm responsive to the commander of NORAD, our Special Forces Command, and our Joint Operations Command. All of that, and you see the little symbols there for Army and Navy. This is what we call a joint organization. So the Air Force now has, since 2016, has functional lead of this organization. This is about 60 people in uniform. Army and Navy personnel are in our lines because this is a tri-service capability. The Air Force just has the lead. When the new policy came out, we've been added another 22 regular force positions and 120 defense civilian positions. So we're going to almost triple this organization over the next 8 years. That's how important that we believe it is to deal with the so what's of those 4 Cs. But these aren't the only Canadians that are involved in defense-based business. If I step back even another level, this is what I would describe as our Canadian Defense Joint Space Enterprise. You see the Air Force in the middle with my position and my teams. If you look at the left, you see the Canadian Space Ops Center integrated with embedded in our integrated command center for our Joint Operations Command in the east end of Ottawa, linked with the Government Operations Center. And down to the left, we deploy what we call Joint Space Support Teams. So individuals or a couple of members that are embedded with deployed forces to give them advice on what space can do for them and what space can do against them. In the middle, industry partners, all of the other government departments, certainly the Canadian Space Agency, National Research Canada, Innovation, Science, Economic Development, all those organizations have space equities. In the bottom right, our Information Management Group runs our Satellite Operations Center. And just to the right of that, our Intelligence Command has a joint imagery center that puts in requests for imagery from space capabilities. And of course, in the bottom right, Army, Navy, Special Forces, Policy, Science and Technology, Material Group, Force Development, Research and Development Canada, our Military College, all of those individuals working on space business. In the upper right is our link with our allies. If you see the first kind of the dotted circle in the middle there, there's a Combined Space Operations Center in Vandenberg Air Force Base, which our CANSPOC is linked with 24/7, just like the UK and Australia, to share information and situational awareness of what's going on in space. Nobody can manage all of their space needs on their own. This really is a team sport, and we're really putting a lot of effort in raising our game in this organization. It's called the Combined Space Operations Group, and you'll see the Five Eyes partners are involved in it, with Germany and France have just been invited to join, and Japan is also interested in joining. So probably, all in all, it's probably closer to hundreds of people in uniform that are doing this business, plus our allies. It's thousands of people that are focused on these capabilities. For my Space Operations Center, like I said, 24/7 on watch. We send out individuals to support deployed forces. They do operational analysis. I don't know if you recall last year, but the Chinese Tiangong-1 space station re-entered the atmosphere. Our teams were doing assessments along with our allies, trying to predict of where it re-entered the atmosphere, and to make sure it wasn't going to be an issue for Canadians. Plans and exercises, mission assurance, standards and training. And there's also a sensor system operations center in 22 Wing in North Bay that manages the data flow back and forth for one of the satellites that I'm going to talk about. On the right are the kind of systems that they use that I won't go into. On the left is the phases when we're doing projects, and I'm just describing this generally because I'm going to talk about some of our new projects. You see those phases. If you see where it says DG Air FD, that's Air Force Development. So I have a counterpart, one-star general, that manages all the air programs. So in the first part, you kind of take the lead to develop the concept for the project, and then you hand it over to an implementer. That bar across the middle is where you hand it over. For the air projects, they get handed over to ADM Materiel Group for implementation. On the space side, most of our projects, because they're surveillance or communications related, we hand them over to the Information Management Group for implementation. And if you see on the right there, we always look for opportunities to collaborate with our space agency where it makes sense for both of our mandates. So what do you think of when you think of a space capability? Probably a big shiny satellite, right? It's a lot more than that, and we need to make sure when we're designing our programs that we take it all into account. So of course it's the satellite. You got to have somewhere to launch it from, which is becoming easier, but again, we still don't have that capability in Canada, so you can get bumped, your launch can get delayed, something can go wrong on launch. You need to have options for launch. You need a command and control concept and capability. You need a network to pass the ones and zeros through. You need to get commands up to the satellite, and nothing on orbit is of any use until that data, information, or outcome comes down to somebody on the ground. All the projects that I'm going to talk about have all of this, and I'm just going to kind of give the highlights. Current capabilities. We currently have a satellite called Sapphire. It was put up, I think, about 6 years ago now. It's the only non-US satellite in the space surveillance network integrated in that system, building situational awareness of what's going on in space. It doesn't look at the Earth, it looks out at space to try and track all of those 25,000 objects that I said. This satellite does on more than 50,000 observations a month to add to the catalog to build everyone's situational awareness on what's going on in space. And this is only one asset in this whole system. But this is a great contribution by Canada. It's working great. It's a year past its design life. I'll talk about a program to replace it because we don't want to end up in a situation where we're not providing that capability. We've got something called Polar Epsilon Ground Station. There's a commercial satellite called RadarSat-2, which we pull synthetic aperture radar data. So radar data down, we combine it at this ground station. We mix it with automated IDES systems, so shipborne transponders. And if you see that green picture, you see the dots. The radar can see where ships are. The AIS data, the transponder data, shows that the ship is actually saying where it is. If there's any ships that aren't saying where they are, we can now pick them out and send, say, another ship or an unmanned aerial vehicle or an aircraft or something to go deal with it. So maritime domain awareness is what we refer to, what this kind of capability provides. And this is integrated through our maritime operations centers on each coast, monitoring all the coastlines of Canada. For communications, for satellite communications, there's tactical, wideband, and narrowband. The tactical is like radio calls. The wideband is kind of big pipes for talking between command centers, and the narrowband is more focused capability. We've joined on with an American system called the Advanced Extreme High Frequency, the AEHF system. So that's your hardened comms, nuclear codes. If everything else goes wrong, those are the satellite capabilities where the signal will get through. Mercury Global is our name for our project on a US wideband global system. So that's a wideband capability that we bought. We paid for a few %. And then for the tactical and commercial piece, we've been doing that kind of ad hoc, and that's no longer sufficient. And I'll talk about a project for that. That bottom circle, the Satellite Operations Center, again, that's run by our Information Management Group. That's the group that manages all the communications that we've established in space. We've got two systems called URSA, Unclassified Remote Sensing Situational Awareness System. So, like a tent with a dish, we can deploy this capability. You see those satellites in the upper left? Those are all unclassified satellites. We can pull data down, combine it with intelligence assessments, and share it with allies and partners, and reduce the latency to get that information if we can't wait for what we call reach back to get that information, back from home. There's two of these systems. They were implemented for a joint organization, and the Air Force took them on last year. We currently have one deployed in Bahrain, supporting maritime domain awareness for operations there. The second one is deploying in Latvia, and we're just in the process of bringing that home for some training. There's capabilities we call navigation warfare. Adversaries can mess with our navigation systems, whether it's for guidance systems or even just for vehicle and personnel navigation. And we need to have the capability to prevent that, or if someone's jamming our signal, or what we call spoofing our signals, they could just shift the signal like a kilometer to the right. If you don't know that, that can be a big deal in operations. We need to have capabilities so we know when this is happening, and we have people trained to deal with it. Where are we looking at in the future? When this capability came into the Air Force, there was a 5-year plan for all of those we call force generation, force development, force employment capabilities. We're now embedding that in what's called the Royal Canadian Air Force campaign plan. So now the Air Force has lead on 2 domains, air and space, and now we're embedding all of this in the Royal Canadian Air Force campaign plan. There's also something under science and technology called the IDES program, Innovation for Defense and Security. This is meant to rapidly incubate capabilities that can contribute to our space projects in a quicker manner than previously. And you see the example in the upper right. So we submitted through the Air Force one of the challenges, and ours was number 13, identification and characterization of space objects. And I won't go through that list, but those are all of the projects which companies bid on. Hey, I got a great idea for that challenge. Went through an assessment process, they're awarded some funding, and they're now going through that development. If they do well, they can get more funding to take it to the next level, and eventually, hopefully, end up on one of our capabilities in the future. So this is Defense's commitment to injecting funding into innovation in Canada. For my Space Operations Center, we've offered to the United States that combined Space Op Center in Vandenberg. We're offering to be a backup capability for that, for partners and allies. We want to do more in the space surveillance network because we need to do better at understanding what's going on in space. And I won't go through all of this, but we might even want to get into things like payload operations. We probably don't want to get into flying the satellite, flying the bus, they refer to it, but the payload that's on the satellite, we might get into that kind of capability. For satellite communications, we're very close to closing an agreement with the United States to get it on for tactical narrowband capability, but dedicated like those other satellite capabilities. What they call their MUO system, multi-user objective system. It's basically like a cell phone tower in the sky. So our troops will have cell phone-like capabilities from 65 north to 65 south, anywhere in the world. In the north, remember I said those capabilities that we rely on, we can operate in the north now, but I've been up there a couple times in the early 90s. It's a pretty lonely feeling the further north you get without communications. And yes, there are some commercial capabilities that are growing around the globe. We need to do better. So we have a program called ESCAPE, Enhanced Satellite Communications Project Polar, to put that kind of communications in the north. United States, Denmark, Norway, and New Zealand have already expressed interest in partnering with us on this program. If I lay that all out for satellite communications, this is out to the year 2040, what all those different types of satellite communications look like. The greens are good, the yellows are maybe a concern, the reds are not good. So we're really transitioning now because of the 4 Cs. Instead of just having project to project, we're trying to create a program so that we don't have any yellows and reds by the time we get all these projects fielded. For surveillance and reconnaissance, probably in May, RADARSAT Constellation Mission. That's a whole of government project led by the Canadian Space Agency, of which Defence is a major stakeholder. We're going to launch these 3 satellites on a Falcon 9, and then those satellites, instead of the single RADARSAT satellite, this will be a constellation of 3. They'll get a lot better revisit rates around the globe. We're implementing a Polar Epsilon 2, so another set of ground stations to pull data down, along with the ground stations that the other government partners will be using to give us that radar capability. And we actually put that shipborne transponder system now on that actual satellite. So we'll get the radar and the transponder data all at once instead of having to combine it on the ground. So we can reduce that picture that we need to minutes as opposed to hours. We already know we need to start a project to follow on that. The defense project is called Defense Enhanced Surveillance from Space Program. Don't know what it's going to look like. It might have more than radar. It might have electro-optic, hyperspectral, multispectral. We're just in the kind of conception stage of that now. But as soon as RADARSAT, the RCM mission launches, it's got a 7-year design life. It takes us about 10 or 15 sometimes for projects. So we know we need to start a project now, regardless of how long the RADARSAT Constellation mission lasts once it's up. We've got a project called MEOSAR, so putting transceivers on the next generation of US GPS satellites. So those transponders will be able to pick up signals from downed aircraft instead of from a low altitude, from a medium altitude. So maybe we can optimize the time of our air search and rescue capabilities anywhere in the world. This is a multinational organization called COSPAS-SARSAT, and this is our contribution is that transponder. And then to replace that Sapphire satellite, we got a project called Surveillance of Space 2. We're not asking for a single satellite, we're asking for 10 years of coverage. Ground-based optical or something like the satellite that's up there. It could be a few satellites, one every couple years. It could be a really expensive satellite that lasts 10 years. That's going to be up to whoever builds it. But we know we need to do more and build on the success of that Sapphire satellite. For the surveillance reconnaissance, again, this is that out to 2040 kind of mapping of our program. And again, we want all those yellows and reds to go away as quickly as we can. If we try to put it all together, everything in the red boxes is what we're working on. The rest is capabilities that we have right now. And as I described, all the integration and collaboration we have with our allies and partners around the world. I had no idea my whole career that we were working on these kind of capabilities. We're accelerating, we're growing, and we're really putting our mind around defending and protecting those capabilities.
Who has questions for General Webb?
Yeah, please.
General Sessionovec, have we put any thought on what we define as weaponization of space? So it's possible to get a satellite to enter in collision with another one. It's possible to have a small satellite co-locate with a military satellite and feed off of the signal that's coming off of it. Do we know knowing that war and hostile action is more of a political decision than a military one, but have we put any thought on what we would consider a threshold action that would go above the gray zone and what we're willing to tolerate an adversary to do?
So yes, absolutely, and that's one of the primary focus areas for amongst the allies right now. We do exercises and war games all the time to try and refine where those lines are. And again, remember I talked about those treaties that have been around for a long time. Now we have to start enforcing them. How close is too close? There isn't a manual written anywhere. We have, differing opinions amongst different operators. What is a weapon in space? The UN treaties stipulate that you cannot put weapons of mass destruction in space. It actually doesn't say you can't put any other kind of weapon in space. You can transit nuclear capabilities through space, but you can't actually station it there. Canada certainly has no program or interest in putting weapons of any kind in space. But as you indicate, if someone puts up one of those on-orbit servicers with an arm that can go grab another satellite, that could be used as a weapon. As you say, if satellites are becoming cheap enough where I can maybe spit off a baby satellite out of the main one that goes and hits another satellite and disables it, certainly those are all concerns. But like I talked about, I think the bigger concern, my bigger concern, is things like cyber warfare. If you launched an anti-satellite system like the Chinese did, the US have done it, but they did it in a lower orbit, so when they took out their satellite, it actually just decayed while re-entering. That's a pretty bold, obvious, easily attributable thing to do. That's a pretty, in most cases, a red line kind of activity. But what about doing things in cyber where you just mess with my satellite? What about if you damage one of my sensors and I can't really tell where it came from? I think you did it, but I can't prove it. How do I react? How do we move forward and protect? How do we defend and protect our capabilities? One of the best ways to do it is exactly what we're doing with our allies. We are cooperating, collaborating, and in some cases integrating to the point where if an adversary has an intent to take out one of our satellites, they better know that we're just going to share capabilities with our allies, so you're going to have to take out ours as well. So again, from a coalition kind of point of view, that's one of the quickest and best ways to achieve the defend and protect mission. Nobody wants conflict in space. There's not one nation that I'm aware of that wants conflict in space. Because of the nature of the domain, if you create debris, you ruin that orbit for yourself as well. Different countries have different levels of reliance on those capabilities, but the more that commercialization, that third C, expands, there's going to be a lot of countries, if not most, that have a direct interest in keeping space peaceful, freedom of maneuver for everybody. So we're absolutely laser focused on trying to refine those assessments, exercising and training and trying to figure out what we would tolerate and not. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely. If you would allow us a corollary, with cyber and space becoming such important domains, but with the regulation not being up to where we are right now, is it time to consider an additional Protocol 3 to regiment these activities, or is that a bridge too far?
So there's lots of effort. Our space agency and others support a lot of kind of subgroups in the United Nations organizations. COPUS is one, the Peaceful Uses of Space, the Committee on Peaceful Uses of Space, so trying to refine those existing treaties. Nobody wants to create a new treaty. I don't know if you've ever seen a treaty created. It takes a long time. So the fact that we have them, nobody really wants to mess with them. But they were created 6 decades ago in some cases. There was a different world then. There was nobody conceiving of some of the elements of the 4 Cs right now. So we're again, laser focused on trying to understand the so what's and working through providing leadership, feedback, information, working with policy, legal assessments. We're absolutely going through all that to make sure that we don't get caught short, not understanding where we think something is at, if activity starts happening in space. Starting with situational awareness. We need to know what's going on in space a lot better than we do now, so if something starts going wrong, we can know. What if a satellite starts going wrong and you suspect an adversary when it really was a solar flare or charging on the satellite? We need to be able to know that. So again, that's why we're putting resources, that's why we're updating our capabilities, that's why we're adding people, that's why we're working together as allies and partners. We are laser focused on offsetting the so what's of the 4 Cs. Yes?
So, since you were discussing, and we all talk about garbage in the seas and garbage in space, with so many people being able to put up satellites, how many could malfunction and cause that kind of problem unintentionally? I have read there's someone who's working very hard on a system to try and capture a lot of this, and it could actually be like recycling from space. How much of that is part of the process that you're involved with? Because it looks to me like there's going to be real potential for problems.
Yeah. So now, I think it's part of the COPUS sort of mandate as well. Any responsible nation that puts something in space has to have a plan for the end of life for that capability. Whether you save enough fuel to push it off in what they call a graveyard orbit where it doesn't bother anybody, or you put up a satellite that there's things like, I think they call them like a drag sail, where over a few years it can slow it down to the point where we enter and burn up and not touch anything on Earth. Not get close to Earth. So if you're a responsible nation, you're not going to launch anything now that doesn't have some capability to deal with itself at the end of its life. There are technology demonstrators that have gone up with kind of like nets to grapple around something, or I think one was like a dart system where it grabs something and then they're going to slow it down. And you could put up these on-orbit servicers could grab something and slow it down enough so that it decays. There's all kinds of things you can do. We're kind of in that transition zone right now where, again, Canada launched the 3rd satellite in space and it's still up there. Because at the time, we didn't think about having to get it down. Now it's something that we're starting to think about. And certainly, the biggest challenge is going to be in the low Earth orbit, where companies are thinking of putting up hundreds, if not thousands, of satellites for communications. What if something goes wrong and those orbits get compromised? That's no good for anybody, including companies. So companies are even commercial ventures are very vested in protecting all these orbits because they have a lot invested in their capabilities. So There's concepts developing. There's best practices that are being that are growing. We'll just have to see how this tracks over time. But again, right now, there's already enough man-made objects in space to cause a problem if it went really bad. I think it's called the Kessler syndrome. A scientist in NASA did an assessment of the number of man-made objects you would need to put into space that if a cascading event or two happened, eventually you wouldn't be able to stop it. We're already way past that number in certain orbits.
Sounds like a business opportunity for somebody to create a, the garbage collection recycling process.
But then who pays for it? When you put up a satellite, that's actually your sovereign territory, so you would actually have to give permission for someone to take it down. Who pays for it? You don't want to cause debris in trying to take another satellite down if something goes wrong. So again, I'm not an expert in this area, but certainly know it's something that a lot of people are looking at for sure. Yes?
My name is Aisha, I'm a professor at UT, and
Okay.
I really enjoyed this because I study non-state actors and their attempt to engage in all kinds of disruption. You said that any state, any reasonable state, would want to make sure that space remains a peaceful domain.
Right.
Now, what about the reducing of the costs, the access into this zone, and the fact that there are, in fact, non-state actors that don't really care about those outcomes? Do they yet have the capability to engage in disruptive actions in space? Or are you imagining some future possibility in which they might gain that capability to engage in disruptive actions in space? What about the threat of non-state actors?
So in an unclassified briefing, I probably couldn't talk about what's already a risk.
Okay.
But certainly, literally, for on the order of thousands of dollars, you could actually put a satellite into space. It'd be a pretty big trick right now to get it on a launch, to get it on someone's launch, and not fully declare what that satellite could do. Again, if allies and partners ever picked up that a non-state actor was trying to do that, we would obviously wouldn't let that happen. Absolutely a concern. Again, probably the bigger concern is things like cyber. You could take out my ground station, put some malware into my system, cut a cable, an undersea cable that transmits critical data. Those kind of things are much easier still than actually doing something on orbit. But every time companies like SpaceX make dollar per pound launch go down, these kind of risks are growing, which is why we need to update policy and regulation to make sure that kind of thing doesn't happen. The example of I'm trying to remember the company. I think it launched on a last year on an Indian launch system, and they didn't register it. By UN treaty, you have to register a certain amount of information of what you're launching, and they didn't either by accident or on purpose. They're taking a lot of heat for that. So it's very regulated, but it's certainly a concern that we need to stay on top of. Yes?
So you know how similar the Russian efforts in these respects are to what you're doing?
Yes. I can say that, what can I say? Any modern military force recognizes what these kind of capabilities can provide. I don't think it's no secret of the amount of systems that Russia has on orbit. They have anti-satellite capabilities, they have jamming capabilities. China is really ramping up their launches. You can't hide a launch. Count the number of launches that they're doing and look into the kind of systems that they're putting on orbit, whether they're dual use, whether it's for civilian use or dual civilian military use. All that kind of information is available online. It's certainly a concern. Yes?
Just as a follow-up to that, we know when the Chinese launch. Do we have any idea what's on board?
Yes. And of course, there's going to be varying levels of knowledge, but again, once with our situational awareness on orbit, and we're putting a lot of focus on understanding better what's going on in orbit. Once you put something on orbit, sooner or later it's going to reveal itself of what its capabilities are, and that's certainly something that we're focused on, as are our adversaries, for sure.
One last question, please.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sir, Simon Wells, thanks for the presentation.
Yes.
You mentioned the Government of Canada's and the RCAF's interest in partnerships to assure our interest in space.
Yep.
Is that at a strategic level of public-private partnerships, or is that accessing space systems like launch delivery vehicles? Sir?
It's on multiple levels. Like I said, our Canadian Space Operations Center, the Space Watch, right now as we speak, is connected with the Combined Space Op Center in Vandenberg, along with UK and Australia. New Zealand has launch capabilities. All of the allies have ground system capabilities. We all have different levels of satellite communication, surveillance, global positioning systems, systems that look at the Earth, systems that look on orbit. So at all levels, at tactical levels, we share training. The exercises and wargaming that I talked about, we're trying to get smarter, faster about what's going on in space, how we would deal with something if something went wrong. So at all levels.
Oh, nice. It's his very own RCMI tie.
Lovely.
Which he can't wear with this uniform, but with something else, I'm sure.
This has been another in our series of webcasts produced by the Royal Canadian Military Institute in Toronto as a public educational service. You can find news of upcoming events and links to our webcast archives at www.rcmi.org. On behalf of the RCMI, this is Eric Morse saying goodbye for now, and thank you for joining us.